Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran. I've been playing a lot of classes and a lot of DPS over in the Shadowlands. And today we just have to dive into it and bully Shadow Priests. I want to apologize ahead of time that this video is a little quite long, especially a video for a single DPS spec. But Shadow Priests are definitely not looking all that great in Shadowlands, or at least currently. I still think there's a lot of hope for the priest and where it's at, but we will judge it where it currently is. I am expecting a complete rework of the spec, as a lot of people are, or a massive redo to the spec and its main mechanics. And of course, a early alpha means early alpha damage, but I'm expecting a lot of damage changes before this spec comes out in the release version of Shadowlands. So let's get to it. First of all, let's get the obvious out of the way. I am not a Shadow Priest main. Originally, I picked up Shadow Priest back in WoW when they still had the orb system, and I did not enjoy the new insanity-based mode of Shadow Priest in Legion. I just could not get behind it. It took me quite a while to get used to it. Leaving Shadow Priest in Legion and moving on to Battle for Azeroth, it was definitely not one of my first alts that I wanted to level. The playstyle just didn't really seem something that I would be into. And eventually I got my priest up and running, and it's enjoyable to play to a certain extent. It is definitely one of the specs that heavily relies on gear, and it definitely saw a lot of popularity in Battle for Azeroth, mostly being one of the strongest classes in raiding environment, but also being at some point one of the better classes and one of the more competitive casters to bring into Mythic Plus dungeons. Hell, today it still is. In PvP, they definitely have a niche of a high CC, but a very super hyper squishy caster when it comes to the gameplay in PvP in Shadowlands. But still, it makes its way, and somehow the priest survives and continues to be somewhat viable to this day. I know it's early to talk about the damage numbers in the alpha, as Blizzard is most likely going to be tuning them pretty rigorously, but currently right now when it comes to damage, Shadow Priests definitely feel very underwhelming. Your dots feel very weak, it is really weird playstyle, and I think it was Battle for Azeroth that for a bit had Shadow Priest's dots do very little damage. Essentially, the playstyle for Shadow Priest was Mind Blast and Mind Flay until you have enough sanity. Then make sure to apply all your dots before you go into Voidform, because in Voidform you'll have Void Bolt, and a Void Bolt will try to juggle your dots as best as possible, but essentially while you have dots as an afterthought, not really as a focus. The dots are simply just going to be on the target, and every time you Void Bolt, you'll extend them ever so slightly. So that's essentially how it used to play for a little bit. And I didn't like that playstyle at all. It feels that the damage, at least without gear, just feels so less dot focused that it doesn't feel quite as good. Certain abilities feel quite okay, like Void Bolt itself feels alright, Void Eruption for AoE feels pretty good, Mind Seer and Mind Flay all feel quite good, Mind Blast feels quite alright, dots just feel a little bit underwhelming. Also, another ability we haven't talked about, that's now a baseline ability, which is Shadow Ward Death. I like the idea that Blizzard is giving Priest Shadow Ward Death back, but right now the damage of it is very underwhelming. For an ability that's generally an execute ability, it does very little damage. It also does splashback damage to you. Essentially, if you are Shadow Ward Deathing something, if the enemy doesn't die after you hit him with Shadow Ward Death, then Shadow Ward Death will do damage back to you. Not a lot of damage, but it'll be some damage. Particularly good in PvP for priests to be able to death themselves out of a blind or out of a polymorph. However, for Shadow Priests, this ability mostly has been an execute ability. And at least, especially in Legion and BFA when it was a talent, it was really good to finish off a target with 2 charges. I think maybe Blizzard needs to do something where Shadow Ward Death needs to be feeling better as an execute by making it do more damage when an enemy is below a certain threshold. I like the fact that you can use Shadow Ward Death on the move, and can be useful for priests to have an extra ability to press while they're moving, but it can be an ability that's not a priority until an enemy goes to low health, but something they can still use outside of the execute range. I think something like this could be really cool for the Shadow Priest playstyle. The highest damaging ability for a priest right now is on a talent, and it's called Void Torrent. It's essentially your old school Legion artifact weapon ability. What it does is it prevents you, if you are in Void form, from losing sanity, and while you're using this ability, it will generate a hell of a lot of sanity. For whatever reason, this ability does the most amount of damage, 3000 over a channeled amount. None of your other abilities barely break 1000 points of damage, and most, if they do break 1000, they're not really close to getting to that 2000 mark. I know, alpha, probably going to be balanced out, but it's still super weird. It also doesn't make sense how this ability would be balanced against the talents it's competing with. I mean, you have Lingering Insanity for a haste buff, which I don't really know if we'll be using that much because there's not really incentive to go into Voidform. And then the other one is Mindbender, which it is going to be shorter Shadow Fiend, but it doesn't do nearly as much damage as Void Torrent. So number tuning aside, which feels really wonky, a lot of people on the forums have been saying that there's really no incentive to go into Voidform right now for Shadow Priest. Those people are right, because current playstyle of Voidform compared to the Legion or Battle for Azeroth just doesn't stand toe to toe. Back in Legion, the purpose of going as a priest into Voidform was to stay in Voidform for as long as possible. You're trying to stay in Voidform for a single session for as long as you can. In Voidform, you would get this massive haze buff to make your abilities go faster and faster and faster. So you went from the sluggish playstyle to literally an insane playstyle where you're insanely spamming your Void Bolt, your Mind Blast, and trying to maintain Mind Flay in between. And it really did give this priest, you know, playing with Insanity Bar, an insane kind of bursty window. Also, while you stayed in Voidform, your dots did more damage. The longer you stayed in Voidform, the longer or the more damage your dots did. And with a higher haste, you had more tick rate for your dots. That means more dots ticking that are doing more damage. In Battle for Azeroth, this got changed, and it took a little bit of iterations and traits being added and removed and added, and the priest eventually started to feel better as the longer you stayed in Voidform, the bigger you built up this buff of crit. And when you exit Voidform, you got this massive crit buff. So the idea was to stay in Voidform for as long as you can, get out of it, and then spend the least amount of time outside of Voidform. Get back into Voidform with minor buffs that you had, but also with this stacking crit buff. You'd also get a small haze buff from the first Voidform that you took into the second Voidform. Those crits and haste made that second Voidform last you longer, so then you would take the remnant haste and crit of that second Voidform into the third Voidform to make that go even longer, which gave you a better buff to take back outside of the form into the fourth and into the fifth, and essentially gave you this very rampy but a very high stat type of playstyle of Battle for Azeroth. And with how your dots interacted with auspicious spirits, every time you're paying crit and it had other dots on it, it did massive amounts of damage. Current playstyle of Voidform doesn't have any of those fun things because you don't have traits, you don't have Legion playstyle. It gives you small amounts of haste and 20% more damage. And that's it. And it just doesn't feel nearly as impactful. But there are a couple of ways that Blizzard I think could change, and here are some of my ideas. I would either make Voidform a cooldown, so it's something like a Metamorphosis, but maybe on a much shorter cooldown for Shadow Priest, where normally you're running around in Shadow form doing moderate damage, and then you can enter Voidform, where you have a very high amount of increased shadow damage that you do, maybe some sort of other stacking buffs, transforming your abilities, and simply making a cooldown where this is the moment for you to do the most amount of damage. Really give Shadow Priest a real cooldown. Some priests, however, like the fact that Priest doesn't have any big cooldowns. You don't have a combustion window, you don't have incarnation, you simply just do damage at all times. Sometimes you do more damage, sometimes you do less. You could still keep Voidform as it is, something you enter from time to time, but find ways to make it more impactful. The only way I could see Blizzard going with that playstyle is give players an incentive to stay in Voidform. You have so many tools to stay in Voidform, from Disperse playing with your insanity, to Talons giving you a lot of insanity through various means with AoE or single target, or abilities to stop sanity drain. You have so many tools to want to stay in Voidform. Give players a reason, a buff, some kind of a passive, maybe stats, to want to stay in Voidform longer. Because right now in the alpha, Voidform just doesn't feel impactful. Yes, it's 20% extra damage. Yes, it gives you a little bit amount of haste. But I feel like that's just not enough. It just doesn't feel quite as fun like it used to, or purposeful, as the other expansions have been able to do. Another playstyle that doesn't really feel that good is the change to your Void Bolt. When you are inside of Voidform, using Void Bolt can be done while you're casting a Mind Flame. So essentially, you as a priest will try to reset your Mind Flay so that you can fit in a Void Bolt while your Mind Flay is being cast. I thought this was going to be a really cool idea, and it seemed like an interesting mechanic, but when it comes to actually being able to test it on a character, boy was I wrong. What sucks about it is the fact that you feel like you have to reset your Mind Flay cast. Like, you're casting Mind Flay at an enemy. I honestly would want my Mind Flay to cast all the way through, but with the way that your abilities and cooldowns line up, you essentially will have to reset your Mind Flay halfway through so you can squeeze in a Void Bolt in between, and then you'll have to go into Mind Blast, and then your Void Bolt will be off of cooldown, and you won't be able to use it during your Mind Flay, and it feels like every time you're using a Void Bolt outside of a Mind Flay, you're losing out on so much value of what that ability would be able to do. I'm not a huge fan. I thought I would enjoy it. I thought I would like it. I like the idea of being able to conserve globals to be able to use an ability while you're casting another ability. I like the idea and what Blizzard was trying to do with it, but I feel like if you are going to play that playstyle, maybe give it more impact to that ability. But the current playstyle, again, I don't want to have to cancel my Mind Flay halfway through in order to press another ability or in order to be able to squeeze another ability in a window. It just feels way too weird. Finally, and we are almost done, I promise you. This is a long video for Shadow Priest, but we have to talk about Power Infusion. So Priest, all specs of Priest have gotten the ability of Power Infusion, which will buff an ally or yourself with a massive haste buff. This can be used on yourself in the past from a talent, but now can be used on other players as well. I know that Blizzard have been trying their best with certain classes to give them other tools to bring into dungeons and raids. Very similar to Enhancement Shamans and how they can bring a totem of Wind Fury that will help other melee have a chance to swing an extra time with their auto attacks. It makes them invaluable, and people will want to run at least one enhancement in most melee heavy raids. And you can now make compositions around such playstyle. However, with Priest and Power Infusion, I just don't feel like how it's going to work. Maybe as a Holy or as Disc, you might give it to a DPS to burn through certain phases, but you can also as Holy or Disc give it to yourself, since those healers seem to be very strong in the current setup of the alpha. As a Priest, it feels like if you give yourself Power Word Infusion, it almost feels like you're trolling. The spec itself isn't designed to do high damage. It is overall not well designed so far in the alpha, and I expect for it to go through a lot of changes. So, as a Priest, essentially you can be brought into dungeons and raids, but it will feel like you need to give Power Word Infusion or Power Infusion to somebody else, like a Destro Warlock when they're checking out Chaos Bolts, or maybe a Demon Hunter that's going through the full rotation while in Metamorphosis. Feels a little bit toxic, and it has opportunity to be quite toxic. Essentially, you're just going to be a Power Infusion buff instead of a Shadow Priest overall. Now, this can change if they adjust Power Infusion, maybe if they allow you to have a portion of the haste that you would give to an ally. Essentially, if they cast Power Infusion on yourself, you gain 20% haste. But let's say you give it to someone else, they get 20% haste, you get 10% haste. So essentially, it'll be 30% split between your two. That would incentivize Priests to want to use it on other players, and in some occasions they will want to use it on themselves, like as a healer or as a Shadow Priest DPS in a dungeon, to get through certain phases of a boss fight to make it easier and push out damage when you're trying to make a certain breakpoint. Certain aspects like this could be adjusted, and I think Blizzard needs to go back to Power Infusion and really adjust that ability. I like that they're trying to get Priests more than just damage in order to be viable. However, this ability alone could be quite toxic in the future, and if I was a Shadow Priest, with the way that Shadow Priests are looking right now, I definitely wouldn't want to feel like a Power Infusion buff. Sorry this video was so long, but I wanted to make sure that I'm thorough with Priests. They're looking like one of the worst DPS classes on Shadowlands so far, and I'm hoping they'll be a lot better. But I think there's going to have to be some reworks done by Blizzard. And other people are expecting reworks for Priest as well. They're expecting the Blizzard is going to announce some kind of a major rework to the Priest, maybe even give back the old school, the tried and true playstyle of Shadow Orbs. I mean, only time will tell, but I guess we'll have to wait and see. I wanted to not make a video where I'm just complaining, but also give ideas and feedback on what I think Priest could use in order to make it better. I hope you guys found this video enjoyable and informative. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. I'm still having high hopes for Priest. I don't think they're completely down in the dumps. We'll see where they go in the future. Thank you all, and I'll see all of you guys in another video.